Hi everybody, welcome to today's webinar, CMS 101, Searching, Procuring, and Implementing. So a little bit about me before we dive in. If you're new to our webinars, I'm Rachel Woody. I'm the founder and director of Relicura. I have 20 plus years of experience in archives, museums, and cultural heritage organizations. And in addition to being a business owner and consultant, I'm also an author, speaker, and people first advocate. A little bit of housekeeping before we begin. A link to this recording and links to the resources we'll be sharing today will be sent via email about 24 hours after the premiere for the webinar. Speaking of which, this session is pre-recorded so that I can deliver the maximum amount of information to you and then be able to follow up in the chat answering any of the questions that come up during our time together. Speaking of chat, please feel free, if you have a YouTube or Google account, you can log into the YouTube player we are using and be able to share your own examples, resources you have, or questions that you'd like to ask during our time. And because we are using a YouTube platform player, you have access to all of the typical YouTube menu for the player. You can access the closed captioning as well as be able to adjust the screen size and ratio depending on which sort of device you are using to view the webinar. And then please just remember and respect that this is my content and intellectual property and is subject to copyright. So contents-wise, it's a pretty large topic. We're going to attack it in a couple different ways. First of which, introduction. We're going to use a couple different words and terms during the time together for the webinar that I want to make sure we are all starting from a same place on. We'll get into beginning of the search, what that entails, what to expect. We'll go through the specifics of creating a CMS specification list, or basically a shopping list to help you go through procurement. And then we'll spend some time reviewing the 6 steps for CMS implementation and migration. And we have a good chunk of resources for you towards the end that we'll go through together, as well as a couple questions. Okay. So why are we here? Collections Management Systems, or CMS as we'll refer to it throughout most of the webinar today, it's a highly complex, typically, sort of database, and depending on your familiarity with database behavior and functionality, let alone what sort of CMS options are out there for you, the topic can be intimidating and overwhelming, especially if you've never been in charge of shopping and selecting one before. So it can be highly technical, especially if you are finding yourself in the open source area of interest for your collections management system. There's a certain level of knowledge that you'll need to have in order to understand or implement those types of tools. It can be a very extensive process also, depending on your organization setting, depending on the opportunities and challenges that are present there, and any sort of budget, resource limitations or not. All of it will typically lead to it being a several months long process. And for larger agencies, sometimes you're actually looking at 1 year to 2 years. Especially if you're municipally funded, there is some very stringent procurement processes that you'll need to go through, which just adds time to it. So something to be aware of. It can be a very long process. It can take a substantial amount of time and energy, even if you find yourself on the shorter end of a procurement process. It still will take you and your team quite a bit of time in going through this particular sort of selection process, let alone implementing. And then there can be multiple opinions and restrictions. So the larger your team is, or perhaps the larger your organization is, the more stakeholders, understandably, that you would need to account for, the more diversity of needs and functionality there may be for your particular procurement process. So that can be there, as well as the restrictions that we spoke of in terms of maybe there is financial restrictions, maybe you have IT or security restrictions. some additional factors that can make the process more complex than it already is, and potentially costly. So it's not a particularly quick, fast, and easy process to go through. It is also not a cheap process to go through. Even if you do find yourself in the open source camp, and open source can and often does mean free, though not always, however, can be viewed as cheaper. But even if you do go the somewhat cheaper route, there is still costs, both direct and indirect, to consider. So again, regardless of whether you're on that end or going completely custom or proprietary, the process itself, regardless of the product you choose, has cost associated with it. As far as scenarios that can lead to needing a new CMS, there are a few different ways you can find yourself here. For those who have not yet and who are new to this, look out for these things because they'll be good indicators that you will be soon going through a CMS procurement process. So first, and perhaps most common, is that the CMS budget changes, whether that is increasing or decreasing. Unfortunately, usually, mostly decreasing. There's just more restrictions to the funds available, could necessitate meaning a change in the product that you are using. Another factor that could change the CMS that your museum or archives wishes to use is the staff interest or ability shifts or changes. For example, if you're going from a mostly volunteer-ran collection to having professional staff or vice versa, maybe you've lost a good chunk of professional staff and you're now working with maybe volunteer staff for the time being. Having that shift in knowledge, interest, ability is all going to change the ability and interest of using your CMS product. There can also be a shift in how the technology is used. For us, in using a collections management system, we are starting to, I think, find ourselves in a new plateau of standard use and functionality, though, of course, with the advent of Gen AI and ability to incorporate that into tools, I think will probably be our next dramatic functionality shift. But as an example, that's a complete shift in how technology could be used. So keeping an eye out for whether that is technology changing or museum or archives needs changing. The through line there is that there is a change in how we want to use the particular technology. Another factor could be a change in operating system requirements. This one is more unusual, but if there's some sort of increase in needing to address risk or security issues, perhaps there's a change in whether or not you can have a hosted instance or if it needs to be like directly in situ. So there can be things that shift from your organization's perspective that necessitates a change in your CMS as to whether or not it can meet those new demands or restrictions. And then finally, CMS death, outdated or merged. So throughout the last several decades, we have seen dozens of different archives and museum collections management systems and related tools that have come and gone. And that is a normal, natural process for many technology and especially software products. From our field, we're a little slower to change in terms of seeing software come in and go out. However, it does still happen, especially if you are in using open source products. If the community or whoever the major developer is or supporter is in that area, if they were ever to leave, those products will typically atrophy. Some CMS products, they'll be absorbed by a larger company and then sunsetted or developed and merged into a different type of product. So there's a lot of different ways where the current system you're using essentially, for all intents and purposes, disappears. And you, even if you stay with the product, so to speak, you will still need to migrate to whatever that new version of it is. So Even if it does kind of stick around, it is still transforming, which means your use of it will also need to transform. Okay, first major part is searching. A few things to understand when we begin the very initial parts of this type of work is understanding the types of collections management systems. First type, open source. So open source means that all of the code that makes a system what it is freely available online through services such as GitHub, and the particular products that are made out of it, because the code is open source, different developers can create different sort of modules or widgets, add-ons, etc., custom templates. So it can be a very rich area of products depending on how well the community is around that product. So for open source, the thing you want to be aware of is how healthy the community is that is currently supporting that open source product. Because if the community is not as supportive or there's not as many resources available, it tends to indicate the level of support you can expect. Because it's open source and not proprietary, you do not necessarily get support, assistance, or any sort of technical troubleshooting because there's essentially no one person to go to and ask for those things. And so for these particular products, you would have to go to the community and sort of crowdsource and troubleshoot with the community what your issue is. So opportunities and challenges there. One of the benefits of open source is it does tend to be cheaper, though be aware, even if it is quote unquote free, there are still costs associated with implementing and using a database. For example, the storage space you will need to host the database and the content you put in it is going to have a cost associated with it. If you are not as technically savvy or don't have a technical person to help you implement the open source product, let alone provide service maintenance, then you may also need to have an outside third-party contract to do that type of work for you, which again costs money. So depending on support, knowledge, etc., it is not free. It's free with an asterisk. There are still costs associated. The second and perhaps most common type is commercial. And with a commercial product or a proprietary product, it does cost money. And there can be two different sort of flavors. The first flavor is off the shelf, which is becoming more and more common for many of the big brand names we are aware of to have some sort of like, here it is off the shelf, minimal to no customizing, take it and run with it. When it is off the shelf, it tends to be more affordable because there isn't so much customizing, because most of the things are already locked in for you. So there's sort of an economy of scale that's happening for the vendor at least. So if you're a perhaps small or moderate sized institution, if you don't anticipate needing a lot of customized or technical support needs, then off the shelf is usually just fine for your purposes and budget friendly. The less off the shelf and perhaps moving into the more customized realm or tools that allow heavy configuration, those will be more expensive. Of course, the more you change something or the more you're asking a company to do something to the product for you, the more it will cost. So there is a huge spectrum out there in terms of what the commercial costs could be. And then third option, of course, which is becoming less common, and I think that's a good thing, is the 100% created from scratch. So not open source, because you are not necessarily creating that from scratch. Most of it's already been built for you. This is very much a like building a database on your own computer, or perhaps a volunteer has volunteered their time to do it. Those are incredibly hard to sustain because of their uniqueness. And typically, once the person who's created it has moved on, whether that is retired or gone to a different museum or what have you, there is nobody left essentially who understands how it was built, let alone how to provide maintenance to it. So there's some extreme challenges there, in at least long-term sustainability for those types of systems. So something to be aware of, especially if somebody is out of the goodness of their heart offering this type of option. It can still be quite a challenge and a risk the longer you are using it. Okay, support and placement, two major things to think of as you are considering types of collections management systems. First of which for consideration is software as a service or SaaS. As general population, we're very used to software as a service at this point. Many of the products that we use, especially software, tends to be subscription model, tends to be software as a service. So you're paying annually, usually, for the access to the product as well as servicing of that product. And so it's very much a ongoing relationship as well as an ongoing cost center, which is becoming very typical, and makes sense in terms of maintaining and continuing to evolve the product. There is a concept of support contracts. So, for example, if you are thinking more open source, but you still need that technical support, you can go through and facilitate a support contract with a third-party vendor. That is a very specific scope of work for support of a different type of product. So a little bit different from software as a service, though, depending on the level of detail that you wish to know, can look very similar, if not the exact same thing. In terms of placement, the products that we are now seeing, and especially after going through a global pandemic where remote access to our collections management systems became very important, many of the products have, if they hadn't already, they are now steadily moving towards being cloud access. That is cloud access as like a default. So even if you were in your archives or museum on your local computer, we are moving towards, as a field, that our software and especially our collections management systems are available if you have access to the internet. There are, of course, exceptions, and some of those exceptions stem out of a security and like risk management area of concern. And so depending on your organization and data, et cetera, you may find that you need a local in situ installing of the collections management system to your more localized computer network. So it's not to say it doesn't exist. It's not to say that it's not needed. It's just that for the most part, most of us are moving towards the cloud, but you could still have need for an in situ implementation. Costs. As you get to know the systems and as you go through the shopping process, cost is going to be something to pay attention to. Every system is going to be different, so it can be a combination of charging per user or license. It could be including a charge per item or per gigabyte or terabyte at this point for many of us. And those will typically be annual costs. So annual costs will go up due to inflation, but they can also go up if the amount of users have gone up, if the storage size has gone up, that kind of thing. There will also be one-time costs. So setup and implementation of the collections management system will be a one-time cost. Doing the transfer and migration of your data. So for many of us, we're already in a collections management system. Getting your data and content from that system into the new system is going to have costs associated with it, even if you're doing most of it. And any sort of custom, whether it's custom backend or custom front end, any sort of customization, and depending on the product configuration, can also have one-time costs, whether that's one time at point of implementation or later down the road when you want to set up something different. Regardless, those are usually like at that point one-time costs. Where to find collections management system options? There are a few good ones. Canadian Heritage Information Network has a really good extensive list of CMS vendors, and it tends to include not just like North American based, but also Australian and like Western European, sorry. So I tend to like them because there's a very broad listing of products, and of which you get to choose across a couple different major territories. And as an asterisk, just because a particular product happens to be in Europe or happens to be in Australia, many of the larger vendors at this point are used to servicing clientele on different continents and tend to have service hubs set up periodically throughout, geographically throughout the world. So even if it's in Australia, if you love the product, chances are they would be more than happy to support you, as well as have a technical infrastructure available to support you. Randomly, Car Library and Museum has a great CMS table. This one tends to be really great for North American and typically more US based collections management systems. Another good one, Collections Trust. This is based in the United Kingdom. So again, it's going to have a good showing of Western European collections management systems, perhaps more robust in the museum area. So if you're looking for some different vendors other than the usual players over here in the North American continent, that is another good one to check out. And then I recommend, especially if you are on the newer side of getting to know the software, using software comparison sites such as Capterra or G2 can be another great way to start learning about the different systems and what they're best known for. So just another way to sort of like dip your toes into getting to know the collections management system arena, because there are at this point dozens upon dozens upon dozens of different tools you could choose that really could help be of a good match for your procurement. And so getting to know all of them can be overwhelming, but also very important. In terms of tips, as you are shopping for your collections management system, I highly recommend asking a friend in the field to see what they're using. This is usually very helpful if you are speaking with peer organizations, because the chances are that the system they use will be a good fit or at least of interest to you. So it's a great first place to start, especially if you're on the newer side of just like not even knowing what the options are. Another thing to think about, or if you're a little shy and don't want to ask your museum friends, just visiting their websites within 5 to 10 minutes, you can usually tell what sort of system they are using. Sometimes it's as obvious as being on the actual landing page or in the actual website once you're in that database. So you can sometimes tell what they're using that way. Taking a look at professional association pages. Some of the larger associations will have directories of different collections management systems, whether it's museum or archives. And related to those professional organizations, if you attend conferences, there's usually some sort of exhibit hall, or at the very least, sponsors of the particular programs that you're going to. And so the sponsors that tend to show up at the conferences you are at, they are already like at least a good match for your area, your geographic area, as well as perhaps your museum's or archives particular niche. So checking out what those particular vendors are is usually a good first place to start as well. Okay, so we got into searching, at least the very like initial basics of how to get in there. Now we're going to move on to a more nuanced part of creating CMS specifications. Before we can get into that specifications part, you may need to form your procurement team. So if it is more than just you and like one other person who will be doing the collections management system shopping, you will likely need to form a procurement team then. And so the composition of a procurement team should represent the majority of CMS stakeholders and users. That way you're able to shop for accurately the type of functionality that you need. The team should be large enough to be reflective of the stakeholders at your particular institution, but small enough to still be effective. When you're choosing this team, I typically recommend choosing like a percentage. So, like 2% of the total museum, for example. Or if it's easier for your brain, I would say no smaller than 3 people if you're like moderate to large size museum, and then no larger than 12 people. The minute you start getting more than 12 people, the harder it gets to have any sort of consensus or decision making for the product. And as you form the procurement team, I recommend having conversations with everybody in terms of what the time expectations are and what the timeline expectations are. So, how many hours a week or a month we anticipate taking up with this particular project, and also what does the duration of that timeline look like. If you're a larger museum and there's any sort of data migration that needs to happen as a part of the CMS procurement and implementation process, you're looking at least 6 months to a year in terms of that process. There are, of course, going to be fallow periods during that time because not every timeline is up to your organization. You're also working with if you choose a proprietary product, you're also working with the vendor schedule. So there may be like some hurry up and wait scenarios as you go through the 6 to 12 months for that implementation. Okay, once you have that procurement team formed, we are trying to work our way towards specifications because the specifications will help us narrow down essentially what are eligible software options out there for us and what make the most sense. So providing a sense of criteria to help us do the shopping, and then we're also going to use that same criteria as like a scoring rubric to help us make a decision on which of the different CMS options we want to go for. So to get to that specifications creation part, there's going to be a series of prompts that you will at least start from. So for staff on the procurement team, I recommend thinking about what tools do I currently use that are required for my job? What tools do I not have that would make my job easier? For example, mass location movements, if not already available, and have to be done manually, having certain sort of like location moving wizard or widget would be a huge quality of life improvement. Another prompt, what tools do I consider as mandatory versus recommended? So any sort of functionality that you use for your job or would like to use for your job that you consider a mandatory part of that particular product. And what tools are so important that it's a deal breaker if the CMS doesn't offer that tool. So depending on your particular collection, your goals, etc., there may be criteria you need for your product that is like a make or break in terms of if the CMS doesn't have it, it's not even worth considering. Questions to consider for museum operations. So this is for all staff to think through, though depending on where staff are in terms of programming or in organizational structure, some may have more information to work on than others for these. But as we start thinking of specifications, thinking, does the digital file backup meet preservation standards? So regardless of my sort of job or functionality, I should be interested in the digital preservation aspects of whichever product we go for. Number 2, what are the digital file types in play? So just even knowing the digital aspect of the collection that is in the collections management system, whether that is born digital and those artifacts are actual digital artifacts, or if they are digital surrogates to our physical collection, one and or both, those are going to have impact on the digital file types in play. 3, are there digital file size storage requirements? So knowing how large that digital file area of your collection management system is, and therefore what you will need moving forward. Number four, what administrative control levels are available. So this is particularly important for those perhaps medium to larger size museums where there are multiple different users, multiple different user types, and you really need to have a more finite control over what sort of user account can do what sort of actions or permissions. For number five, what customization is needed on both the front and back end and can the CMS accommodate those needs? For many of us, typically off the shelf is just fine, but depending on your collection and on your goals, you may have some specific customizations that need to happen. This is definitely something that should be identified as part of the specifications because it can really make or break the product that you select. And then six, what sort of reports or other automation tools are desirable to support museum or archive staff? So thinking about report types that you typically use or would like to use, any sort of automation tools that you would like to have available. If you're more archives based, if there's like finding aid publication is important, or perhaps contributions to a consortial database, that kind of thing can fall into this particular area. And then questions specific for decision makers. So not all staff may be like ultimate decision makers, but these are factors that will come into play as you ultimately end up choosing a collections management system. So first of which is to be aware of the one-time budget to cover those one-time costs. As a refresher, the one-time costs can be that data migration piece, implementation, anything that helps install and set up your collections management system so that you can then get into it and use it in a more day-to-day way. Number two, what is the annual CMS budget and is there a plan to increase it year upon year? So there was the one-time costs, there are also the annual costs, if at least as long as you're working with any sort of product that is not necessarily that open source free product. So having a sense of the annual budget, but not just that, knowing if there is built-in accommodation for inflation for the price of that product. Number three, do we have the necessary staff in place to make full use of the CMS? This is one area where I caution organizations where it can be very tempting and alluring to go for a really highly technical and beautifully complex system, but if there's not the staff capacity or interest to use that full range of beautiful complexity in the system, then it doesn't actually make sense for you to get that kind of CMS, and perhaps something more straightforward or off the shelf makes much more sense for the staff you have and the interest that is there. And then four, do the staff who need the CMS want additional training or support? This is an incredibly important thing to think about because it is not always an immediate part of the particular CMS product and service that you sign up for. However, because staff come from different backgrounds, they come from different knowledge bases, even if they're used to working in a collections management system, the truth is every product is different. So even though they may understand that there should be like these basic functionality of our collections, knowing where that functionality is or how to execute it appropriately, that part is most likely going to look different. So at least building in part of any sort of training and support and ensuring that you have access to that, not just when it's that initial launch of the collections management system, but ongoing. So once you work your way through those prompts with the procurement team, I recommend setting up a spreadsheet for gathering the different criteria and indicating, while working with the team, indicating what's required and what's recommended. Depending on the size of your procurement team, depending on the number of criteria you may have, it may be a very simplified rubric, or it could be a bit more complex. So taking a look at the simplified rubric, we have pictured here essentially a spreadsheet with columns across the top, and each of those column headers has like a required as like a prefix, and then it's got the particular feature or functionality. So like required, we need it cloud-based. Required, we need to be able to customize the particular catalog record. Required, we need report creation. And then recommended, we want to be able to stream media, but if we can't, it's not like a deal breaker. That's why it's just a recommended feature. For pretty straightforward, smaller teams, it could just be a binary yes, no, like yes, required, no, this is recommended. For other teams where there's more nuance or complexity of needs, maybe you want to do a scoring of like a 1 through 3 or a 1 through 5, and then average those scores to show the much more detailed spectrum of where things are in terms of this particular feature or functionality is like very important because the average of it indicates so. Whereas this particular piece of functionality is kind of meh for everybody. And so that particular scoring is going to demonstrate where it is in the sort of mid-level of being important. So there's a number of ways you could go about it, but the main components in place are the same in terms of identifying what the features and functionality are, identifying whether yes, no, or with a sliding scale, what or where that particular feature or functionality is in terms of importance or requirement. And then as you begin to go through the collections management systems and perhaps you start having demos or conversations with them, as you go down each row, you can start to make notes of, yes, this system meets these first 5 requirements, or no, this system is lacking this particular requirement, but it has the rest of these other things. So you'll be able to have in one place your criteria, how important or required that criteria is, and then how each collections management system measures up to that criteria. As you are scoring, you will likely do a combination of researching the product online, having some perhaps email discussion with the vendor if you are reaching out to proprietary systems, and then if it is proprietary, and sometimes even open source, depending on who's supporting it, they will typically offer a demo and or sort of sandbox opportunity where you can sort of see or at least test out features and functionality. So as you go through each of those things, scoring the collections management systems as you go will help to reveal which systems best meet your needs. Testing and vetting options. So assuming that more than one collections management system, well, even if it is just one, you should always do testing and vetting. If there is more than one option, testing and vetting can usually help you narrow it down. Regardless, doing testing and vetting for the collections management systems that are your front runners. You can do so by requesting a sandbox to test tools depending on the product. Some of them are very generous with allowing sort of sandbox situation, others do not. So it's worth asking, but it's not like a they all do it kind of thing. If sandbox can't be provided, then you definitely need to ask for a tutorial or a demo of the product. And you can specifically request to see areas that are of the most important or most interest to you, which is to the benefit of the vendor because they want to make sure that they're being scored appropriately, which is completely up to you and what you need. And then I recommend having each procurement team member test their area of the CMS, testing if you have sandbox, reviewing and asking questions if it has to be a demo for that particular area, but essentially giving each person agency for their particular area and responsibility for that particular area to understand how well the CMS product works or doesn't for them. In terms of vetting steps, as you narrow it down to the 1 or 2 sort of products, I recommend asking the CMS vendor any sort of remaining questions you have, especially if those questions are to help clarify whether or not that product meets your criteria. And I recommend requesting 2 or 3 references from the vendors. Sometimes they have these references readily available, other times they don't, or it depends on what sort of organization you are before they'll provide some. but I do recommend connecting with at least two different sort of institutions that use that particular product, because you'll be able to connect with them more on a peer level, and they'll be able to be more candid with you in terms of what their experience is and how well or not the particular product is meeting their requirements. All right, so that is the searching and scoring part. Assuming you've made it through that shopping process, we are getting into that procurement area. So what is procurement? Essentially, procurement is like that end of the shopping piece. And it's the act of officially acquiring something, in this case, a software product, where an aggregate of steps is taken to inform the search and selection process. So whether or not a purchase is being made, the procurement process is one that museum staff, archive staff, whichever sort of institution you're in, is something to be engaged in thoughtfully. It's not a quick process, it tends to be a longer process. Now, procurement will depend on what your organization looks like. For example, if you are a city, state, or federal organization, the procurement process is going to be pretty heavily dictated. In which case, great, you can ask for what that looks like and how to get started. There's usually a procurement person or department that you will then work with to establish the specifications. The vendors you've reached out to that meet your criteria, you'll invite them to submit a bid. And it's at that point an official procurement process to go through in order to help meet whatever sort of tick boxes you need to for compliance. If you are not a municipally funded organization, you're more on the nonprofit side or private side, there may not necessarily be a procurement process, or there may be one if your institution's large enough, but it won't be perhaps nearly as stringent as if you were city, state, or federal. So just ask the question if you're not sure in terms of who's in charge of helping to vet and do selection of software, and who needs to be involved. Because sometimes, depending on your institution, you'll need some sort of like IT person, for example, who will need to be involved in those conversations and selection process. Regardless of official procurement process or not, there will be some sort of contract negotiation and signing. I do want to highlight that while the vendor, if it's proprietary, while the vendor will provide you a contract, contracts are usually always up for negotiation, at least that scope of work part. And when you're thinking and entering into a collections management system contract, it is pretty typical to have some conversation in terms of, this is our budget, this is like how many licenses we're looking for. And one area I see that helps with negotiations is if you know you're going to be with the product for at least 5 years, which like nobody wants to switch systems more than every 5 years, trust me. The longer you commit to that product, sometimes the cheaper that annual rate can get. So, for example, if you were working with a product and the contract negotiation was just 12 months, it will probably be a very expensive for that 12 months. But if you offer to sign it for 3, 5, 10 years, that annual cost over time can be greatly reduced. So asking those types of questions, especially if you know you're not going to be hopping products for at least a certain amount of years, can be a great sort of lever to pull if you're looking at a pretty big price tag, but still have like major budget constrictions. Another thing, be aware of all costs. So again, when thinking back to when we started, costs that were one-time costs, costs that are annual costs, keep in mind that if you're doing an annual contract, there's likely going to be an annual increase. Look for that in the contract and make sure that you understand that. And also maybe do some math on whether or not that increase in percentage is in line with average of inflation year over year. If it is more than the average of inflation, I recommend negotiating it down. Otherwise, if it's in the rate of inflation, then That's the cost of doing business. So I wouldn't recommend trying to negotiate that point. I recommend establishing a timeline, especially when you're in the contract process, because you're not just working with your own organization's timeline and restrictions. You are now going to be working with another company's timeline and restrictions. So if you are on a timeline crunch, and that's not necessarily understood by the vendor, and they've not disclosed what sort of timeline they're on for your implementation, then there can be a pretty severe mismatch. This was exacerbated during COVID when almost everybody who wasn't already using a collections management system online was like desperately and quickly trying to switch to one. So understandably, collections management system companies were like really hit hard in terms of timeline. That has gotten much better, especially now that we're almost in 2025. But still, be aware of timelines and where you are within that timeline, because it's not just yours to be aware of. And then assigning that responsibilities piece, especially if you are doing any sort of data migration, having an excellent understanding of what it is the vendor is going to do for you versus what they expect you to do. There can be a mismatch there. And if you've not already accounted for staff time, or let alone knowledge of data cleanup, then you will want the vendor to do the heavy lifting on that part. Or if you do have that staff capacity, great, negotiate with the vendor because they won't need to do it necessarily. So some balance of costs there. Implementing. So you've done the searching, you've gone through the procurement process, whatever that looks like for your particular institution, you have selected, you have entered a contract. We are now implementing. So 6 sort of major things to think through as you move through this implementation process. Step 1 for you, get to know the new CMS, because the new CMS is going to dictate quite a bit of how you approach and use it, but it's also going to inform like the immediate things you need to do, like getting your data ready to exit your old system and get into the new system. Step 2, prepare for CMS implementation logistics. So this can encompass like where the digital files need to be migrated to so that they can be accessed by the new system. This could be setting up single sign-on, security and verification for staff to log into the new system, things like that. Step 3, learn how data and content will export. So export from your old system, but we're also going to need we're also going to need to think about what that import piece looks like and what your export, what format and shape that needs to be in for that future import. There will be testing and troubleshooting, of course, especially when it comes to data migration. The last thing you want is to lose half of the data because it didn't make it in there, or it makes it in there but not in the right place. Step 5, any sort of cleanup. All of us have data and past practices that could use some sort of cleanup, and usually this migration to new CMS is where that comes to light and becomes a priority. And then 6, establishing or reestablishing best practices. So always when switching to a new system, there's going to be different decisions that we want to make. There's going to be best practices we either need to or want to recommit to, or perhaps choose a different method or standardization. So this is a perfect time to revisit that, and if they haven't already, to codify the best practices at your institution. So step 1, getting to know the new CMS, watch the tutorials. Many of the CMS vendors often have many videos now, a lot of them on YouTube, in terms of where to find things, how to do a particular functionality. So especially if it's a proprietary product, those likely exist. And actually, in the open source, there are so many great institutions out there who have been so generous in recording and are on YouTube. So even open source, I think you'll find some good stuff. Read the literature. It may perhaps be the most dry and most boring thing to read, but at least get a PDF so you can do some keyword searching for the functionality that has the most impact on your job. I recommend attending the demos and or trainings. So once you've signed on to a product, there will be periodic demos of new product functionality or to help with a particular process that is a bit more technically complex. I recommend attending those if they're topically appropriate for you. And many of the trainings at this point, especially for proprietary products, they'll have some sort of training library at this point, which will have on-demand videos. So you don't necessarily need to wait and sign up or try and schedule training. I recommend viewing examples, whether that is vendor-provided examples or if you have peer museums who are using the same system. It can be incredibly informative to see how a similar museum is using the product that you're now starting to get to know. And then playing in the sandbox. If the system has some sort of like shared groups sandbox, or if there's an area of testing you can do within your own system, knowing where those are and if that is possible, because the most effective learning method is typically the exploring and doing type method. So having a place where you can safely do that is very important. Step 2, prepare for implementation. So if you're working with a vendor, software as a service, having that pre-implementation meeting is going to be really critical where everybody understands what is happening and why. Reviewing those implementation procedures, especially if you're getting a more proprietary product, there's going to be a set of procedures in terms of the activities and timeline, as well as system requirements. If you are on your own, thinking through with the relevant procurement team and technology staff, the steps that need to happen in order to install and implement an open source product. You will need to walk through anticipated implementation steps. Some open source products are pretty thoroughly documented, so there may be some resources there for you. Otherwise, you may need to create your own based on your understanding of how the system works and needs to be implemented. I recommend speaking to each person and what their part in the process will be at this point, especially if it's being self-guided, and then identifying what needs to be in place. So these are things that typically the vendor would help out with or support with, but if it's open source, you may be on your own. So step 3, learn how the data and content exports, and essentially knowing what format it needs to be in to then be imported into the new system. So knowing the shape of the data as it comes out of the old system, as well as like how the digital files come out and what that looks like and what shape you need to get it in. Data will typically come out, the most common tends to be like a CSV, comma separated value spreadsheet. So as long as column headers are mapped accurately to the new system, then that is a good first start. Depending on how stringent the field formatting needs to be, you may find you still need to do data cleanup because the field formatting is different and perhaps more stringent than the system you were in previously. And similar with digital files, depending on the system you are in, some systems for some I'm sure it was a good reason at the time, but they do like a triangulation of like a reference key they're putting the digital files over here, but they're only giving the object record the digital file key. They're not actually like attaching the object to that record. So sometimes you actually need to do that triangulation for the new system. Otherwise, they're going to have no way to connect the digital file with your object record. So stuff like that is important to figure out how it comes out of the old system and then what it needs to be in to get into the new system. So testing export is incredibly important. In fact, I recommend doing it while you're shopping just because that can have such an impact on the implementation piece. I recommend checking the quality of the type of data that you're getting out of your system because sometimes the way we see it in the system is different than how it comes out and is not necessarily usable. I recommend the identification of any critical data cleanup, especially if it's unable to migrate into the new system and you're going to lose it otherwise. Also think about how to ensure new CMS structure in its setup and making sure that the migration piece is having the data go to the correct places in setup. Doing test data and content importing, so testing the shape of that data and content you have getting into the new system to see if you need to adjust exporting, and then checking the quality and adjust as needed. So it's going to be sort of a trial and error, especially for the first couple of times. But getting to know the shape of your data, how it comes out, and what shape it needs to be in is incredibly important for this implementation process. Step 4, test and troubleshoot. So just like a rinse and repeat until everything is working as it should. If you are continually running into issues and you're working with a vendor, ask the vendor. That's what they're there for. They have seen many, many different sorts of migrations and implementing new systems. They will likely have seen this type of thing happen before and can at least offer some insight as you are doing it. And step 5, cleanup. So this part will usually always come up in data migration. It's up to you in terms of like how deeply you want to get into data cleanup as you migrate things into the new system. Sometimes the data is easier to clean up in aggregate in a spreadsheet. Other times it's easier just to wait for the data to get in the new system to use cleanup functionality. But things to think about. So data entered does not adhere to local professional standards. Very common problem, maybe something you want to address at this time. When the data exits the system, sometimes it loses cohesion, for lack of a better word, or there's things that you know are in the system that's not present, so it's not exporting correctly. Or when the data enters the new system, it's either losing or adding data for some reason that should or should not be present. So there's a few different points in the process where data could be missing something, not meeting standards, being corrupt through part of the process. Number of different ways, but things to keep in mind and add to the cleanup list depending on what you're finding. And then 6, establishing or reestablishing best practices. Even if you're moving to a very similar collections management system, it's always good to reestablish a best practice, especially if there are specific ways you're going to use a field or a particular functionality that is not necessarily specified for that field or that not everyone would necessarily know. It's important to document so that as people start using the new system, it can stay as consistent as possible, because consistent data is the most effective and successful data for search and discovery. Things to think about. Where is the data stored at each step? And what I mean by that is, where is the data stored when it's in the CMS? Where is the data stored when I take it out? Which local computer, hard drive, Dropbox? And then where is the data going to get into the new system? For example, some vendors, it needs to go through an FTP, for example. And then where is the data stored once it goes into that new CMS? So having a clear understanding at each step, and also ensuring you have plenty of storage depending on those different steps as you move through the implementation process. Another thing to think about is, how long do you keep the old system to overlap with the new system? This is especially important if you know the implementation and that data migration piece is going to take a few months. There's likely going to then be a few months of overlap where you have that new CMS, you're getting it up and running, but you still need your old CMS to provide access while you're waiting. Next one, to what level of detail do you keep decision makers in the loop? Because this can be a very technical process, sometimes it's just not necessarily to give the level of detail that we're living in this current area. So just sort of gauge your communication level appropriately. How will you migrate and test the data? So having that data migration and testing plan in place. And then what external systems rely on the CMS and how will their connection be addressed? So thinking about if you're contributing to something like Digital Public Libraries of America, so some sort of like collection portal, or thinking about if the museum artifacts in the CMS are linked to a LibGuide or some sort of other like museum exhibitions publication, for example, knowing where those connections are and then updating them so that they're not lost from the user perspective. A note about funding. So because this process can be long and because it can be costly, at least with just the one-time fees, let alone the annual fees, there are some different federal grants that are available that could help you go through at least part of the process. The most common federal ones are Institute of Museum and Library Services, IMLS, National Park Service, National Endowment for Humanities, Council on Library and Information Research, and then at the state level, each state gets Library Services and Technology Act funding, so it's federal funding but distributed through a state entity. And quite a few of the, it's LSTA is the acronym, quite a few of those grants I've worked with clients on to go through this procurement process. When to consider an expert. So we covered a lot of both technical and like process specific things. There's not just the shopping for a new product, there's also a data migration piece to consider. It can be incredibly complex and time consuming. So when does it make sense to work with an expert or some sort of outside person to lead you through this process? So I recommend if it's been like 5+ years since the last CMS procurement, whether it was you but at a different museum, that experience is still very helpful. But if none of you have been through one in the last 5 years, then it can be helpful to have that outside perspective, even just to know the current market. If staff availability is limited, which like it almost always is, but just knowing how much capacity it takes in doing just the shopping and selection, let alone like that implementation and migration piece. If there isn't expertise or availability of experts on the team, so you as a museum expert, you are definitely still an expert. It doesn't necessarily mean you're a CMS expert. So having a CMS expert on the team can be very helpful. If there's any sort of complication factors involved, so whether that is there's multiple partners in the system or that need to be in the system, like different organization partners, if there's mixed collections, like it's a museum collection, but also an archives collection, and maybe we're moving two systems into one system, or the back end or front end needs heavy customization, any and all of those aspects like immediately up level complexity on not just searching for and selecting a product, but then also implementing that product. And then a couple other things that may mean an expert would be helpful to have on your side is if you want someone to lead you through the process. So it's the process heavy piece is one you'd like somebody to actually do the heavy lifting on. And or you need an outside expert to use as an advocacy tool with decision makers. This is also something that is common with clients that I work with. It may be that they've gone through somewhat of an informal CMS shopping process previously, but the decision makers or admin above want them to go through it with an outside consultant before a formal recommendation is made. It is common, though I definitely share peer frustration in not being listened to if you've already made a decision. All right, questions. We got a couple questions in. First one, we use archive space. However, I'm working with a consortium of other repositories to determine if we can create a portal that can do two things. One, harvest and or host copies of archival collections data from repositories with their own platforms. And two, host archival collections data for smaller repositories that don't have their own platform and for whom obtaining and managing their own platform would be both cost prohibitive and or too high a technical curve for what they can manage. And in parentheses, especially as lone arrangers who do not have a high comfort level working with computers in general. 100%. That is definitely true, especially for at least I'm based out in the Pacific Northwest. There's a lot of small but mighty organizations that have a great team of volunteers, but they don't necessarily have the budget or interest to get their own CMS. So yes, part of this is thinking about the consortium piece. So thinking about a collections management system as a software, but perhaps also as a process is something to think about. So I want to shift us to the answer as we walk through this. The California Libraries has a great collaborative consortium portal. I'm less familiar with the nuts and bolts on Online California, but I do know a bit more about the process for Northwest Digital Heritage, which is the link and example we've got here. For Northwest Digital Heritage, they do offer those two different ways to contribute that our questioner posed. So they do a harvest mechanism using Open Archives Initiative, the OAI PMH, for metadata harvesting. So their first option is, okay, other archive, you've already got things in archive space, we're going to take these things, or a Mecca or whatever, we're just going to harvest them with our tool and then put them in this digital heritage consortium. The second way they do it is the second part that the questioner suggested, which is the particular institution, for whatever various reason, doesn't have its own collections management system. And so there's not a place to like go and do that harvesting, at least not online. And so having a secondary way to contribute, in this case via spreadsheet, is another perfectly acceptable mechanism. So for Northwest Digital Heritage, they will take contributions via a CSV, JSON, or XML file. So meeting the two criteria that our questioner asked about. I will note here that the process and the tools being used for the consortia piece is not predicated necessarily on the collections management system. For example, it's not the collections management system that's doing the harvesting, it's connected to the harvester, which is an important technical point, I think, in terms of when you're shopping for a CMS, at least not, there's not a CMS that I'm aware of where that is just like a normal part of functionality where it's going to take things out of other CMSs and put it in its own. Maybe we'll eventually get there though. But it is normal to have some sort of API, some sort of harvesting tool or function that can connect one or two or multiple, one to many in many of these cases, for that harvesting piece. So I do want to differentiate, because this is not necessarily a CMS product question in terms of the CMS won't have this functionality specifically. Other notes I want to make, many of these consortium pages, are not just pages, but databases, they tend to also be representative of DPLA hubs. DPLA is Digital Public Libraries of America, and for the Northwest Digital Heritage, not only do they gather and provide this consortia type portal here at this particular website, but they then also will contribute that data and digital content to DPLA. So they're serving as a DPLA hub, to use their lingo. So something to be aware of, because that's an option. The important parts here, and again, back to process and not necessarily specific to the collections management system, but there needs to be agreed upon best practices. I am familiar with Northwest Digital Heritage in terms of the data requirements, the quality of the data, how they're using specific fields, the format of the data in those fields. Those are dictated out of necessity, not just for consistency of data, increasing discovery and use efficacy, but also just being able to harvest and or gather and incorporate it into their system. The data needs to be in a particular way. And some of the consortia areas can offer support and training. It sort of depends on the particular service, on the resources they may have. Many of them start out grant funded, but then have to shift to like a maintenance mode at a particular institution. And sometimes that transition can be a bit rough because support becomes a little bit more anemic. But do be aware, especially for smaller organizations, like Northwest Digital Heritage has some great documentation for institutions that are thinking about being contributors and how they can do that. So very supportive in terms of exploring that more, outlining the process. So this may be a great example to check out in terms of the difference being it's not necessarily about the CMS product you choose, but it's about the tools and functionality outside of it in addition to the process. Next question, what level of control does the database administrator have over individual user accounts in terms of permissions and data entry oversight? Specifically, can the administrator customize access to certain features or restrict editing capabilities to ensure data integrity across the collection? So asterisk, it depends. Many collections management systems, especially the more proprietary ones, this is becoming such a commonplace ability, at least in terms of being able to establish user accounts. Depending on the system, there may even be user types. So for example, there could be a user type that's like super administrator, and they can add, edit, and delete anything versus like it's an editor. And so like they can maybe add and edit data, but they can't delete records or files. So depending on the system, there can be different delineations that can be assigned either at the user type level or at the user account level. That said, there can be nuance in terms of how granular the permissions are. They could be as large as the add, edit, delete concept, or they could be as granular as I want this user to only be able to see and edit this part of our collection. The more nuanced and granular it gets, the tougher it is to maintain from like a long-term perspective. But depending on the number of users you have, depending on your use cases, that may make sense for your particular institution. I would say if you are at the shopping part of the CMS, if this is especially important to you, I recommend requesting it as an area that is included in the demo so that you can get a sense of the level of granularity that is offered by that product. Because every product is different and because your needs may be different in terms of what will best service your needs, it's definitely something to request to see. But yes, to some extent, for the most part, if there are any sort of user accounts in the system, there's usually some sort of level of control. The difference is just the granularity. Okay, resources. There are a lot depending on what you need. So this particular book, How to Select, Buy, and Use a Museum Collections Management System, while it is written for the museum folks, it is true of pretty much any collections management system that you may be shopping for. It goes through the procurement process in more detail. Lucidia Press is very kind and offers free e-copies for anybody who attends my webinars. So if that is of interest to you, you can get a free e-copy there. Similarly, we also collaborated and wrote a survivor's guide to museum grant writing. Again, museum in the title. If you are a cultural heritage organization, the museum grant fundamentals will be true and applicable for 99% of you. So if that is of particular help, check that out. Also free e-copy. If you are thinking of grants, and if you not necessarily don't need the book, I would recommend picking up the grants workbook and templates because In the templates section, I included 4 different type of grant project templates, 2 of which are digital products, and one of those 2 includes like acquisition of collections management system. So if you've never written a grant for helping you go through part of that one-time part of the process, having a look at the template example could be very helpful for you. And for this particular one, again, free copy, because Lucidia is very kind. For the person who asked about the consortia for Northwest Digital Heritage, I collaborated with them last year, which is part of how I know so much about the process, though again, they do an excellent job of putting the process on their website. I partnered with Oregon Parks and Recreation, and we wrote a companion guide specific to like that data preparation and cleanup piece. So even if you're not going through a collections management system migration, but you're interested in data cleanup, this book will be helpful for one or both in terms of getting your data ready, and especially if you're getting your data ready to go into a new system. So it talks about consortia and contribution, but it also talks extensively about that data preparation piece, reviewing and evaluating your data all the way through to different approaches of data cleanup. Webinar resources, depending on where you're going from here. We did a digital collections management fundamentals webinar last month that was really popular. That particular one may be of interest if you are still sort of wondering, is it a collections management system I need, a digital asset management system, and or a preservation management system? So that webinar goes through more of the detail of the differences and overlaps of those systems. Also, earlier this year, we did how to make the case for a better museum CMS, advocacy points, especially if you're needing to lobby to your decision makers that you need a new CMS. If you're interested in that data cleanup piece, we started off the year with some data cleanup, specifically using Excel as our cleanup tool. If you're interested in that open source conversation, we have open to open source. I need to do a follow-up because it's been a couple of years, but I would say probably 90% of the content is still accurate in terms of things to look out for, products to be aware of, that kind of thing. And then we also have the CMS, what's essential, what's hackable, and what does it cost. So especially if you're in sort of a tight spot budget-wise, you need a tool now, and you sort of need to like MacGyver it for at least the next couple of years. That might be a fun one for you to check out. And then if you're interested in digital collection management services that my team offers, of course, you can check out the website. We also have with Lucidia webinars and blog posts we've done on collections management systems. And then all of our webinars end up on the Relicura YouTube channel. And if you are interested in webinars and you're on the newer side, if you sign up for the newsletter, you'll get all of the typically once a month news for those if you're interested. So those are there. And that is the end. So thank you all so much. We're going to take a break for the next couple months, rethink how we're doing webinars and rethinking content for the next year. So that's all to say. I hope you have a great holiday, and we'll see you in the new year.